Okay, let me kick off, and please stop me if I'm if I need to be stopped. Okay.
Deal.
Okay. So first, I'm gonna spend almost no time presenting myself. I think it just won't. You know, it was probably still too much time. I will only say I'm here and happy to speak to you folks, and I'm actually pretty honored that it's two meetups together join the effort to host this. It means there is a shared interest in what I'm about to share, and of course that gives me a lot of honor and pleasure. Have been working in this space for 20 plus years, out of which about 15 or so I do stuff that has the word A associated with it, and I'm very skeptical about when it comes to using the word A, because it has been brutally misused and abused lately. The A stands for Agile, so go ahead and figure it out on your own, right? I think it should tell you something. This industry has become tremendously overloaded and overflooded, so we have to be careful about what we see, what we do, what we read, and where we get our information. That's just something I remind myself daily. I am going to also give this visibility to you right off the bat in case we run out of time at the end. LeSS.works is a great asset to explore if you want to learn about LeSS in depth and at your own pace. This is my email. I'm very transparent. My LinkedIn, my free Slack channel. If anyone has any questions, they can always reach out. Also the meetup, and of course stuff that I teach from time to time, lately almost every week. So that's something I'm going to share with the organizers, and you know, I'm sure you're going to receive this information. Now I'm going to say this first. I'm trying to I try to build my light agenda around what has been posted on the meetup, and hopefully I'll stick to it. And if I deviate a little bit, you can bring me back, or you can actually ask me to deviate a little bit if you feel that there's a lot of value in saying something that is not budgeted for, right? But I will rephrase, I'm going to paraphrase this, right? Large-scale Scrum, and of course, we can talk about LeSS implicitly without explicitly naming it LeSS, is so much more than just a framework. It's an organizational design framework, if you will, but it's about org design that includes various organizational dimensions and domains: HR policies, finance and budget, and vendor management. This isn't something that you can easily unwrap and install on an existing organizational structure. It does require significant rethinking about how your organizations operate today. I'm going to touch upon 3 LeSS adoption principles in the next few slides, and hopefully you can also appreciate my style. I'm a bit of a sarcastic person, a little bit facetious, so I try to deliver points sometimes by making a joke or using a cartoon, and very often of my own production. So my hobby, unpaid job, is creating cartoons, if you will. Okay. So first, let me give you a bit of history so that you understand what LeSS is and what it's not. Large-scale Scrum was not created in reaction to market needs for scaling, and many other approaches and frameworks and operating models are exactly that. Hey, there's great business in Agile. Let's do something that we can show the rest of the world we can scale. None of that. 2008, the first book ever was written on lean and agile development. There was no intention to create this into a framework. In 2010, there was another book that was written on LeSS, very deep dive, actually not an easy read. So we don't recommend reading it first today. And only in 2016, we had the third book written on large-scale Scrum that touched upon principles and frameworks. So if you ever wanted to go back and read on your own at your own pace, we recommend starting with the first book, called the Green Book, then go to the Brown Book, and then go to the light beige book. Read them in that order because they're just easier consumable that way. This small image is the courtesy of Michael James of Seattle Scrum of New York, of the United States, with some great artifacts on LeSS as well. But that's the way to do it. Of course, large scale Scrum, like I said, it was not a reactive way to generate business or retain market share. It was very natural, very organic, very proactive way to describe how teams could work together cohesively in large product development environments, okay? And of course, there's 600 plus experiments about LeSS that have been documented over the last decade or so. That's a pretty huge number, so you can try and avoid some of them. Now, this may not be obvious to everyone, and I say this in my classes when I teach them, but also every time I speak to anyone and who brings up the point. Organizational structure is the first order factor or variable that has impact on organizational ecosystem. Everything else that just follows, right? Culture, mindset, behaviors, norms, values, those are things that are important, but not the first degree of criticality. If we address those, as opposed to the org design, we're going to be looking for superficial indicators. We're not going to be looking for deep systemic root causes. And this is sometimes we have to say this, some less experienced people do not stress this enough when they talk to senior management. And that's important because organizational design is the first order thing. Everything else just follows. In fact, the fifth Larman's law, Craig Larman is one of the co-founders of LeSS, says culture follows structure. You define your culture, you define your structure first, your org design first, and many, many other things will follow thereafter. The three LeSS adoption principles that I would like to stress: deep and narrow versus over broad and shallow, top down and bottom up, and use volunteering. Now, these three are very important to understand. And of course, we're just barely scratching the surface of LeSS body of knowledge, but these three should be really the front runner. Let me use one of my latest and most favorite graphics on large scale Scrum. And so you can have the pleasure of seeing what it is and what it's not. So what you see on the left-hand side, it is not LeSS. And that's what we often see when companies adapt something that is easy to unwrap and install, something that does not challenge organizational design problems that they have today. So on the left-hand side, you got a very broad and shallow. Oh, you know what? I have it the other way. So for the sake of the recording, I absolutely must reverse this. This goes here, and this goes here. So apologies for the confusion. That's how it goes, guys. What you see on the left-hand side is broad and shallow, is very superficial. And when we see companies spending a lot of time looking at best practices, cookbooks, agile processes and tools, RACs, KPIs, metrics, velocities, it should be a ring. It should be a telltale sign to you. They are most likely looking for superficial illusion of improvement as opposed to real improvement. Now, we don't say these things are not important. We just say they are of secondary degree of importance. And if you really want to get them right, you have to look at things that are much more systemic, much deeper. So on the right-hand side, where we see a deep and narrow, deep, you know, this is a deep cave, but rather narrow cave, but top bottom and bottom up approach. That's really what LeSS would be. We look at org structure, HR policies, site strategies, vendor management, finance and budgeting, sales and procurement, stuff that is really, really organizational, systemic. And of course, from the bottom, we'll look at team's health and longevity. All these are much more critical elements than just looking at velocities and metrics and RAGs and KPIs, because these are probably even of tertiary degree of importance. And of course, it is very important where it comes from. If it comes from some centralized power tower of best practices, it rings the bell. Next one was a little awareness raise for you. With broad and shallow, we oftentimes see these. And I'm going to pause for 3 seconds to let you read in before I paraphrase. I tried to coin this problem as a deck-driven transformation, not to be confused with test-driven development, which is TDD. This is DDT. And we oftentimes see these problems when organizations are so hooked on heavy documentation, on best practices, on tons of wiki pages and Confluence pages and box notes, they produce lots of paper that talks about agility, but doesn't really mean that they actually improve agility. And that's how we end up with power towers of organizational structures that we know today, existing org structures being relabeled and reframed into agile structures. And that's who produces these artifacts. I admire those companies that run, that take seriously agile roles and improve their HR norms and the way HR works and recognizes these roles. But I would recommend you be very mindful and cautious if you see this bad SQL being ran against your HR database. This is an example, and I'm sure this doesn't take a rocket scientist to understand what this SQL means. This is when you relabel existing roles into new roles by adding the word Agile or Scrum to it, and now calling it a day, right? And oftentimes we see organizations do it in a very ill-defined way by looking at the pay grade of an individual. Oh, well, this person is a senior manager. Who can he become on Monday? On Friday, he is no longer a manager. Well, let's call him a senior coach. Well, this person is at a slightly lesser pay grade. Well, let's make them a Scrum Master. So without any education, without any investment into an individual growth, this is a way of kind of that just raises alarm. Here's an example of another problem you see if your organizations are deeply ingrained into a race against maturity metrics and bonuses that are associated with it. That's another big telltale sign. And we see many organizations fall for this crack. They get so much so much hooked on metrics, maturity metrics, and maturity models. They pretty much lose the faith in real agility. I'm going to spend 30 seconds discussing this. This is probably well recognized but unnamed copy paste of the something that was created more than a decade ago for one small company, now becomes in a very toxic way to relabel existing org structures into chapters, squads, tribes, guilds, etc. And many companies do that. And this all comes together as a combination of the problem, because if a large consultancy installs something like this, that's usually accompanied by a tooling solution, you end up paying a lot of money for the solution that will not work. And for many companies, it's not yet an aha moment. They're willing to pay the price. I'm going to steal and paraphrase the quote from the co-founder of LeSS, one of them, Craig Larman, who says, on the notion of one of the principles of LeSS is deep and narrow and top bottom up. You cannot really change your organization and to make it more agile if you look at technology domain only on R&D. You really have to look much deeper at legal practices, product management, HR policies, site strategies, yada yada. So there's so many more domains, organizational domains, that we need to look at as agile pioneers, consultants, evangelists, whatever the name you like. I try to tone down on mine to make your organization more agile. In fact, I don't use the word agile lately. Lately meaning at least X number of years. I use the word adaptive. For the most part, adaptive is the synonym of the word agile, and this is more native, more natural to many people. Speaking of multidimensional, multifaceted agility, not just R&D, not just technology, in large-scale Scrum, we look very closely at some dimensions that are usually left out in superficial agile adoptions, right? Like, for instance, in this book, in the third book that we recommend reading, we spent a lot of time, well, we say Bas Vodi and Craig Larman, with in conjunction with the attorney, have written this pretty comprehensive primer on how to write agile contracts. So if you are in business of you're in business with a third party, a consulting company, or a vendor that produces, develops a product for you, you really want to consider reading this. right? Or at least understand what agile contracts are. That's just another dimension of organizational dynamics that we typically don't see companies paying attention to. They think we can continue doing business the way we do today with third parties, with external consultancies, and yet we're trying to become more agile here. We're going to combine our people with their people. We're going to staple them together, put them on the so-called Scrum teams, and all will go. It ain't going to work. Again, a huge input, huge emphasis we'll make on performance appraisals and performance evaluations, individual versus team. I'm going to say no more, but I'm going to say no more than majority of companies are 30, 40 years behind in understanding this very important concept. It has been already proven decades ago that the way we do performance evaluations today is very, very suboptimal. But still many companies do that because it's linked to budget, to bonuses and budgets. Another huge concept, the third principle of LeSS adoption, and it's a very important one, is everything should be done by volunteering, at least for the most part. And I was in the breakout session before we rejoined together as a group, and some folks were mentioning also, and this is not the first time I'm hearing this, oh, we have to use SAFe, we have to use this, we have to use that. We were told. Who told you this? Where did it come from? We oftentimes don't even know, we don't even know where it came from, but people are being told they have to do certain things in a certain way, which is pretty top down, right? And and we can only expect compliance with this approach, not commitment. So in large scale Scrum, everything is based on volunteering. When we select a product group for LeSS adoption, we actually cover this as a part of the pre-LeSS flip assessment and runway. Usually takes a few months before we flip X number of teams into LeSS sprinting. When letting people into a product group or letting them out. So we recognize that not everyone wants to be a part of the LeSS product development group. And the same thing goes, some people really wish to be a part of the LeSS product development group, but today they sit outside of the org structure. So we have to let people in and out. It's a bit of a revolving door at the beginning before we flip the switch so that we can build a LeSS product group from truly dedicated, not compliant, but dedicated and committed people. So when we form teams, we use volunteering because it's actually self-creation. We don't assign John, Joe, Jim and Julie to this team, and Mike, Joe, Rebecca and Susan to that team. Management doesn't do that. Management supports in other ways, but teams self-organize. And it goes on and on and on. When we create communities, unless we make a huge emphasis on community creation, a lateral structure that is horizontal and something that does not retain the same organizational policies and norms that your typical vertical structure does. And by the way, with XYZ model that I just showed the graphic for, we oftentimes see companies take an existing vertical, flip it on its side 90 degrees and calling it a chapter, while retaining our chapter managers and performance appraisals and all other things that are detrimental to a community. When teams pick up backlog items so everything else here actually from here on is kind of common sense of info basic Scrum for one team Scrum, but it's important to understand that unless we just inherit this part as well, okay? We want people to be willing to be in LeSS as opposed to being voluntold to be a part of LeSS. Just to give you an idea of size of LeSS adoption, it's 2 to 8 teams, and we can't really discuss too many whys behind, but it has to do with capacity of a single product owner, capacity of so the internal dynamics, and it's just something that we came to this number by trial and error, by inspecting and adapting. So 2 to 8, it's a recommended size of a LeSS product group, which in fact means roughly 70 plus minus a few people if you think of Scrum team being 3 to 9 people, if you just do simple math, right? One product owner, one backlog. We don't use fractalism. One PO per team, and you got 20 teams. Now you got 20 POs. They're just going to draft tons of BAs into a so-called PO role. And one thing to remember, less adoptions require months of preparation and then flipping a switch and off we go, start sprinting as a less team, as a less product group. For less huge adoptions, we actually take much longer time and they're incremental. Obviously, we don't have time to cover it today, but anything beyond 70 plus minus a few people, if we have many more people involved in product development, we consider less huge. Now, this hopefully will be an aha moment for many because just take this to the bank. Less is not many teams doing their own Scrum. Less is 2 to 8 teams scrumming together in the same product. So think of it this way. This is not less. And maybe it's not the best analogy to call a jockey as a product owner, but think of it that way. When 6, 7 horses running together ad hoc, trying to compete with each other, maybe working on individual components, right? As opposed to cost-cutting features. You may have a lot of local optimization going on with it, right? Each one has their own person with a strategy, vision, and goals and priorities. And this is less when X number of teams are dragging the same horse carriage together, and you have only one person that sets strategy, vision, and sets the unified course. Okay. And if you wanted to look at sprint cadence in less, in one sprint, that's what it would look like. Multiple teams sprinting together at the same time, on the same cadence, same heartbeat, same takt time, right? And the benefit of this, of course, so the benefit of having parallelized sprints, not staggered sprints, would be this, right? You can do CI/CD, you can do a lot of integration, you can minimize or eradicate almost as many asynchronous dependencies as you can. So large scale Scrum is Scrum. And if you understand Scrum down cold, this would be also common sense to you. Because you're not trying to put Scrum underneath in the basement and put a bunch of programs and projects and portfolios over it. So large scale Scrum is Scrum, and it's used for product development, and it's used in those cases where you have a product that is very wider defined and requires more people working on it. This is another graphic illustration that I would like to share with you. Just a sneak peek of what it could look like if a bunch of people were rowing together, right? So each team may be of different size, but they pull in the same product in the same direction, the same product owner with vision and mission and strategic goals. And we have X number of users and external customers that are helping with clarifications. Now, the whole discussion here is required. How do we separate duties and responsibilities? Who does what? I mean, in fact, when we cover this in a one-day less review training, we still have people walking away with some additional questions. So this is a pretty interesting subject to unpack. It takes much longer than that, of course. And I'm going to finish off before we go to Q&A by giving you a genuine advice. First of all, do not expect to have many real less adoptions, at least not today. And in fact, some folks I just spoke earlier on this call, they said, well, I never heard of less, so I'm eager to learn. Absolutely. Less was never meant to be a marketable, commercially successful product. And those so-called agile frameworks that we know of today are precisely that. And they have been put together by people that are not practitioners, they are not agilists, they are RUP specialists. And of course, with that comes a lot of knowledge how to make something sellable. So don't expect less to be the best selling product. However, those organizations that are willing to change for better, and especially these days when if you don't improve the way you live, you're not going to survive. Perhaps maybe people are going to start looking more closely at less. If you go back to your organizations, right? If you even want to talk about less, and if you know more, if you learn through training or self-study, don't try not to sell less installations. Whatever you say, whatever you do, try to be more implicit first. Use system thinking and lean thinking. We actually teach it in less training so that you can speak implicitly without using abused terminology. Don't rush with decisions and selections. Like for instance, when you pick the right product for less adoption, give it some thought. This is the whole thing about the pre-less runway that we have to build so that individuals, so that proper people make proper decisions about right products to choose for LeSS adoption. Experimentation is super critical. Do not be feared of that. If your organization is supportive of it, at least not in this domain, not on this product, don't bother. Maybe pick something else. Don't take along implicit resistors. And this is a loaded statement. You probably don't know what I mean. Listen to John Cotter's video on resistance to change. People that are implicitly resistant but say yes, 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 let's do it, are going to cause you more harm than good. So you have to know who you're taking with you in a spaceship. Of course, don't forget about importance of organizational design. That's like the first thing that you need to do. Senior management has to be brought on board and they must give an informed consent. They understand what they're about to do. If they're just going to support your spirit, write a check for $500K and say something in town hall, great, off you go, do less, that's not support. They're just, writing off some money. Do not proceed without informed consent. Like I said, you have to get it from proper people, because just a few people that run your organizational domain, at least where you're trying to plant less seeds, could be much more influential than 20, 30 first, second line managers that have no influence whatsoever. So look for right people at the right level. Of course, do not proceed without guidance of experienced LeSS coaches. However, those are whoever you find out there with experience of adopting LeSS. Most likely they will not be there forever and ever and ever, right? They will be joining you for some time, helping you, getting you up to speed, and then gradually disengaging and letting you own your own effort. And of course, don't forget to have a lot of fun. I am going to stop here because my appendix is really just a handful of additional graphics, and LeSS has so many rich graphics that will probably take me forever to describe each one of them. So I'm going to pause now. I'm going to take a breath, and I would like to give it back to you folks. If you have any questions you would like to ask or any clarification that you need, please do. I keep letting people into the waiting room, by the way. I'm sorry, into the people that's joining. I have the privilege.
We have a few people running late. So Jean, there were a few questions
Sure.
in the chat. In the meantime, Anthony or Joanna, could you perhaps give folks the right to unmute themselves? So the first question here, Jean, for you was if the slides are going to be available afterwards.
That's usually the first question we always get. The answer is yes. I'm gonna trade the video recording.
All right, guys. Sorry, I unmuted everybody, so everybody has to mute back. Please mute back.
You may want to mute all.
Guys, please mute back. Yes, I unmuted everybody, so please mute back.
Yeah, I don't think it's gonna work, Joe.
My advice, since I've done this a lot, mute everyone and unmute.
Okay, I muted back everybody, but it will, Coca, can you send me the names? Because I would have to go through all chats, so it will take me a few minutes. Or just read the questions. If you have questions, just read the questions.
That's what I'm gonna suggest, everybody. I'm gonna go through the questions in the chat. So if you have any questions, please post there. So Jean, after the slides, the next question was, is there any best practice on how to design organizational structure?
First of all, okay, right off the bat, there's no such thing as best practice. It has been invented by PMO. Best practice implies that there is nothing else to improve, already at best, which is very orthogonal to what we say, very antagonistic to what we say in the Agile Manifesto says, inspect and adapt. So they're great practices. Some of them are amazing, but none of them are best. That's one thing I was going to comment. But now, how to start? You definitely need to find right people at senior management level to support the effort. Much more comes with that, right? You need to assess the organization. You need to understand what they're working on. You can't just grab an organizational pocket and say, okay, we're going to do less here. You need to find the right place where LeSS will actually be able to exist. Like for instance, something like identifying a product that has some customer centricity, either facing an external customer or you can easily identify an internal user, would be a good place to experiment. Of course, like I said, prior to switching flipping the switch to LeSS, you need to do some assessment. You need to do some runway, some prep work, which includes training, coaching, and mentoring individuals that are identified, starting with senior management. That thing that's called informed consent is your way, or my way as a LeSS coach and or design consultant, to make sure we have right senior management support from start, not just in spirit and in slogans, but with real genuine support. Managers should be willing to do what's called Gemba or Go See, Genshu Genbutsu in Japanese. Managers should be willing to go down to the trenches and see what's happening down there. I actually see the question. So I'm hoping this was somewhere useful, what I just how I just replied to it. So do you mind if I just read? I can actually look at these questions now.
Go ahead, Gene.
Pick and hock. What is the difference between save and LeSS, and what's the best? So no intention to bash or scold save. I'm happy to share a very long list of references from very credible sources, from Agile Manifesto co-signers, from Scrum co-creators. SAFe has nothing to do with agility. It is an extremely successful operating model, or whatever you want to call it, to be unpacked and installed on the existing org structure. It doesn't really challenge much. There's a plenty of information about this. It is the easiest one to unpack and install, and that's why companies do it. So I'm going to leave it at that. You cannot compare an apple and an apple and a tractor. Those are two different. You can probably compare apple and an orange and explain how they're different, but not an apple and a tractor. Question: do you? Okay, it's coming too fast, so they're scrolling. What kind of metrics do you have to use? So, just like LeSS Scrum. Scrum does not prescribe any metrics. When teams gel together, when they form, whatever they decide the right metric should be, that's should so be. Do not impose, do not install metrics on agile, on adaptive teams, because the minute you do that, you're going to have a feedback reaction of metrics gaming. System gaming is an amazing thing people know how to do. If it comes from the top of the house, whatever is measured can be massaged and can be molded into something else. Okay, so be mindful with that. And I'm kind of answering these questions, maybe questions superficially with a deeper dive that's required. What else? It's good to have flow metrics through. So again, I also saw something about mixing Kanban and Scrum. Kanban is a great, so I learned Kanban myself over years from credible, authentic sources, right? Lots of what Kanban teaches us could be very efficiently used to visualize work inside a sprint for Scrum as well as LeSS. So it is not something that, but I wouldn't be just immediately jumping into the solution. Okay, let's take Scrum, let's take this, let's take this, let's mix it in like a big jambalaya, mix it up and off you go. That's thoughtless. I would approach it from a thoughtful perspective. Understand Scrum, understand large-scale Scrum, understand organizational design implications of both, of LeSS. And then if you need to improve visibility or workflow management or cadence or throughput or anything else within a single, within Scrum, you can leverage your Kanban knowledge, but don't try to relabel and refurbish and just introduce extra confusing terminology. Let me take a quick look. So if you, again, another one, I say if your company uses SAFe and you can't change the framework, what would be the first thing you would bring? So, okay, if something has been by force installed upon you, we are using SAFe because someone said. I really can't advise you on this. First of all, you have to be safe. Make sure it's safe, like personally safe. Don't get yourself in harm's way. If you understand less, let me rephrase it. If you understand organizational design implications and system dynamics that we teach in less, and become savvy enough, you can start rebuttaling some of these dysfunctions that you see happening within safe organizations by implicitly challenging people, by implicitly making statements. Don't talk about less, talk about feature teams versus component teams. Don't talk about less, talk about local optimization. Don't talk about less, talk about you know, how ineffective it is to create a release train engineer and give her or him all the responsibility that should be owned by a single team. Don't talk about less, talk about how ironic it is to put Scrum in the basement and put multiple programs and projects and portfolios on top of it. So you can do things explicitly as well as implicitly. And for your own sake, try to do it implicitly. Thanks for, okay, thank you for coming, folks. How does it work with teams mixed both Scrum and Kanban? So again, we're not talking about less here, we're talking about Scrum. So do we like seeing individuals on Scrum teams being, you know, being diluted in attention and the scope of work? Don't we want people to be fully dedicated in Scrum? Yes. So that's kind of natural to me. So it doesn't change anything for less. Like I said, workflow management and some other great visualization techniques that Kanban brings, by all means, use them inside a sprint. If the question is about how to split work, how to split someone's capacity 50-50, that's like typical. We get, just like always, I'm going to say, it's a very suboptimal way to do it. In fact, you will make your Scrum very crippled, and it will make your Kanban very crippled, because now you got multiple priorities, multiple sources of truth. You're diluting someone's attention multiple ways in multiple directions. Not a good thing to do. But of course, this may not be sufficient. You have to go back and explain to someone, whoever made that decision. Then maybe you want to use system thinking knowledge that you gained through large-scale Scrums, through studying large-scale Scrum, and by doing so, you can, you know, bring across your point. I'm picking this ad hoc. You outline less. How does it differ from other scaling Scrum techniques specifically? It's a loaded question. I mean, and I would not even compare it to SAFe. I think it's just, you know, completely ironic. These two have nothing to do with one another. The only other, there's a great video on that by Nigel Baker of the UK. And again, if you remind me, as when I share this, I'm going to send you that link. I can probably say that the other known, but probably not as known framework that supports Agile values and principles is Nexus by Ken Schwaber. It has some nuances about Nexus integration team and change and shift in priorities from developers when they refocus from their respective Scrum teams onto Nexus teams. It's a very loaded, for majority of people here in the call will be very confusing. One thing I must say this, it's very strongly not recommended to have a single team and a single product owner as a 1-to-1 ratio. And there's some frameworks out that actually recommend that, surprisingly, because they come from people that actually have done a lot of great work for basic Scrum. That 1-to-1 ratio ends up in a product owner becoming a TOO, or team output owner, and oftentimes we end up with BAs and proxies and quasi people, really not product owners, put in this position with lots of local optimization, lots of unnecessary coordination, and lots of priorities confusion. So I wouldn't even compare less to that. And I'm sorry, I probably would say this: in large-scale Scrum, we have only one product owner that sets priorities for all teams of less product group, up to 8 teams. So there was no local optimization there. And it's a pretty senior, pretty seasoned, and pretty empowered role, the product owner. Down below, this good game. Okay, we'll cover that. How are you facing release rigidity? It looks like these teams achieve significantly less releases, so that less training, less business agility. Yeah, I'm sorry, without actually explaining a little more what this means, it's hard for me to understand exactly what was asked. But I can just say this, in large-scale Scrum, just like in Scrum, and we keep saying this, LeSS trainers always stress this often, large-scale Scrum is Scrum, so it actually becomes a second nature. We don't have dedicated release teams. We don't have dedicated release engineers. We don't have dedicated release managers worse yet. Teams own their own releases. And because in large-scale Scrum, all 8 teams work together on the same code base, out of the same repository. It's really about internal minimal coordination that's required, and there's a huge, there's a lot of opportunities to work together. Probably it's easier said than done, right? But when we cover this in depth, it becomes much more obvious. Release rigidity oftentimes, resistance to releasing incrementally at the end of every sprint, mostly comes from organizational design problems and sphere of ownership and sphere of influence. Scrolling all the way to the top. Maybe I missed some here. Thanks for the great. Okay. How does it work with the one product owner having to write? So, okay, having to write stories for 2-day teams. This is, I'm sorry, and I say this with a lot of respect to whoever posed the question. It is not the responsibility of a product owner. I'm not sure where exactly we missed this part. If Ken Schwaber saw this now, he probably would flip. It is not a responsibility of a product owner to write stories or to own JIRA tickets or to update statuses. It is the shared responsibility of everyone who's involved. And stories are not written, they are spoken. And 99.9% of the stories I've seen in cases where this is the problem, it's also stories themselves are not real stories, or some maybe technical tasks. In large-scale Scrum, we separate, we delineate very strongly between 2 types of information flow: prioritization and coordination. And I'm sorry, prioritization and clarification. Prioritization goes through the product owner. Clarification goes through users and stakeholders. And the whole dynamic of this needs to be unpacked and discussed. But a product owner is not an administrative worker. He or she is not a JIRA ticket mover. He or she is not a story writer. That's how you end up with business analysts writing stories, local optimizing for themselves, and having a one-on-one relationship with teams and becoming conduits of Scrum. Let me quickly, very quickly, share my one of my cartoons that describes this problem, and maybe this will. And by the way, like I said, I like cartoons, so this is a place you can go and pick up a lot of cartoons from me. This is the one I was referring to. So if we see this problem, and we see this a lot, you will most likely have this poor person, junior BA, called the product owner, writing stories, whereas a real product owner is way down here. So you got proxy, no proxy, or proxy, or proxy, or proxy, and then you have the Berlin brick wall, and then you have tech side. So that's something we need to break, right? So this entire, from this red phone all the way to this proxy, it has to be removed, right? Real teams should be talking to real customers, and a product owner should be, he or she is based on customers, so definitely. Let me just, this is a pretty important point. That's why I'm kind of taking this seriously, right? So let me switch. This is a completely different deck, but since there is a very interesting graphic, I'm going to answer this question. This is the deep dive into LeSS training, but here's the graphic I wanted to allude to. All requests go through the product owner and become priorities. Clarification, as much as possible, goes through users and customers directly onto teams, right? I strongly recommend watching this video again. So I'm digressing. there's a lot of stuff to share and so that you can understand the dysfunction of having one-to-one ratio between a team and a product owner, and mislabeling or misdefining the role of a product owner the way that really doesn't support Scrum or less. Okay. I'm just being also conscious of time, so I'm going to make sure I'm not over the time limit, and I'm referring myself to the organizers. Folks, make sure you stop me if I'm over the limit.
Okay, so Jenna, maybe one more question, and
sure.
then
Why don't we make it live? So I'm already read so much from. I don't want to be anchored to any one of those.
Okay, so I will unmute everybody. Okay.
Por que eu falo com o Gendel? Pode gerar um problema político, dependendo do posicionamento que tiver.
Not sure if that will work, no?
Não, isso aí é
Então, assim, aí eu faria.
Okay.
Hey guys. No, that won't work. So I muted everybody back. So maybe the last, randomly selected question. Let's see who last. We have the last question here. So maybe let's choose the last question from your experience.
You want me to do it?
Yeah.
Okay, so my question, not what was asked. So let me say this: the biggest question. One question. Unmute. Okay. The most common question, the most common practical question I get all the time, especially from people that have gone through more in-depth understanding of LeSS, more in-depth study, self-study, or have gone through training, is what do you start and how do you start? Like, I want to go back tomorrow. I want to use some of this. What do you start? Well, first of all, I always say, sleep over this. Let cool heads prevail. Because if you go on emotion and an instinct, oftentimes you will, have a bad impression. You always want to start with, first of all, you want to build some internal expertise, maybe call it a coalition. Going in personally by an individual goes back to the company and tries to talk some of the stuff we teach in LeSS. If there is no one internally who shares the same knowledge or the same expertise, it's going to be pretty tough. It's going to be almost frustrating, right? But for that person, it's also frustrating because once you start seeing certain things, it's almost impossible to unsee. So somehow you need to let these demons out, right? So you need to learn how to talk to people implicitly about things that you now see and they may not necessarily see. So try building up internal knowledge implicitly by taking people through system modeling exercises. We do a lot of those in training. And so people that come out of that, they become more of system modelers. So you have to think of yourself as someone who understands organizational dynamics better. And once you have this knowledge, now it's easier for you to see and hear local optimization. It's easier for you to discuss matters with people more implicitly. And of course, you want to climb up that organizational ladder to a person who is going to be a true supporter of your LeSS adoption. It doesn't have to be the CEO of the company. It could be further, it could be lower down below somewhere, but at senior enough level to support your LeSS experiment. And if you get that person's attention and commitment, then we can discuss what else to be done, right? Let me put it this way. It's not coming on Friday or on Monday and changing everything overnight. 2-3 months, in my experience, takes time usually to prepare your teams for a flip. It's not, doesn't mean that people do not work while they do it. They still work in the old-fashioned way, but you start gradually moving them. You teach them, you educate them, you coach them towards better ways of working. That's the question I usually get. How do you start? So I'm going to finish on this note. I'm going to put this screen up just for a second. People are welcome to reach out directly if they have any questions, especially my Slack channel. It's a free channel. You can always ask me a question. I'm pretty attentive. And yeah, I mean, by all means.